The wheat was nearly ready to harvest the morning Dorothy Engel left for town and never came back. She was 31 years old, a farmer's wife, a mother of 2 boys who could already operate a tractor before they could ride a bicycle. Dorothy stood 5'4", with dark brown hair she pinned back every morning before she made breakfast, and she had a habit of humming hymns under her breath while she worked. Not full verses, just fragments, the melody floating in and out as she moved through a kitchen that smelled like coffee and biscuit flour. She was the kind of woman her neighbors described the same way every time, with the same word, steady. In a county where droughts came and went and equipment failed and the market turned against you without warning, steady was the highest praise anyone could offer. On the morning of September 14, 1971, Dorothy told her husband, Earl, that she needed to run into Harlan Creek for feed receipts and a new fan belt for the old combine. Earl was out in the east field and waved her off without looking up. Their oldest boy, Donnie, 9 years old, watched her drive away from the front step of their farmhouse. He remembered the color of the sky, the pale, hard blue of Kansas in late summer, the kind that means no rain is coming. He remembered her arm out the window as the truck turned onto the county road. Donnie Engel was the last person in his family to see his mother alive. To understand what happened in Harlan Creek on that September morning, you first have to understand who Dorothy Engel was. And to understand that, you have to go back to the place that made her. Harlan Creek, Kansas sits in the southwestern corner of Harvey County, population 2,200 in 1971. Though the number was always slightly in dispute because half the farms lay outside the town limits and their families only came in on Saturdays. It was the kind of town with 2 churches, a co-op grain elevator visible from 12 miles out, a hardware store that doubled as the social hub of the county, and a diner called Maddie's where the coffee was strong and the pie was real, and every booth had a laminated menu that hadn't changed since 1959. The railroad came through twice a day, northbound in the morning, southbound in the afternoon, and people set their schedules by it. Dorothy had grown up 12 miles east in a town even smaller than Harlan Creek. She'd met Earl Engel at a county fair dance in the summer of 1960, married him the following spring, and moved on to his family's 400 acres of wheat and milo when she was barely 21. She had 2 boys in 4 years, Donnie in 1962, then Curtis in 1964, and built a life that fit the land she'd married into. She joined the Lutheran Women's Society, organized the church potluck calendar, and every December baked 7 different kinds of cookies that she distributed across the neighborhood in tin boxes tied with ribbon. She drove the boys to 4-H. She kept a garden that produced more tomatoes than any one family needed. She kept the books for the farm because Earl's handwriting was unreadable, and she had a head for numbers that surprised people who expected otherwise. She drove a 1966 Ford F-100 pickup in a faded green that had once been brighter. The morning she left for Harlan Creek, the truck was freshly washed. Earl would remember that detail for the rest of his life, the truck gleaming in the driveway, the way the morning sun caught it. She should have been back by noon. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Earl Engel came in from the field, called Dorothy's name into an empty house, and went to the phone. He called Maddie's diner first. He called the co-op. He called the farm supply on Route 96. Nobody had seen her. He called his neighbor, Ray Brandt, because he didn't know who else to call, and by 3:30 that afternoon, Ray was pulling into the Engel driveway with his wife Norma, while Earl tried to decide whether to call the sheriff. At 4 p.m., he called the sheriff. Harvey County Sheriff Gordon Phelps arrived just after 4:30. He took Earl's statement in the kitchen. He wrote down the truck's description and license plate. He told Earl that in most cases like this, the person came home on their own, and that there wasn't much to do before dark. He said they'd get a real look in the morning if she hadn't come back. She hadn't come back. By the following morning, a search was underway. Deputies drove every county road between the Ingle Farm and Harlan Creek. 3 members of the Lutheran Church walked the drainage ditches along Route 96. Ray Brandt organized a group of 8 neighboring farmers who split up and covered the field roads south of town. Dorothy Ingle's truck was found at 11:40 a.m. on September 15th, parked at the far end of the lot behind Harlan Creek Hardware, the engine off, the keys still in the ignition. Her purse was on the seat. Inside it, her wallet, her driver's license, $7.40, a grocery list written on the back of an envelope, and a folded receipt from the feed co-op, dated that morning. She had made it to town. She had run her errand. Nobody saw her leave the truck. Nobody saw her at all. The doors were unlocked. The windows were rolled down 2 inches. Her biscuit flour grocery list sat open in her purse, like she'd only just looked at it. There was a single coffee cup ring on the dashboard, the kind left by a wax paper cup from the diner, still faintly damp. Dorothy Ingle was gone, and for 52 years, nobody could explain why. Sheriff Phelps ran the investigation for the first 3 weeks. He focused early attention on 2 men, a drifter who'd been seen near the hardware lot the previous week, and a farmhand who'd been let go from a neighboring operation 2 months prior and had a record for petty theft in Reno County. Both men were located, questioned, and cleared within 10 days. The drifter had been in Wichita on September 14th. The farmhand had 2 witnesses who placed him at a cattle auction 60 miles away. Deputy James Aldrich, a 27-year-old who had been on the force for 3 years, took over as primary investigator by mid-October, when Phelps turned his attention to a livestock theft ring that was taking up most of the department's resources. Aldrich was methodical and quiet, and the kind of young man who wrote things down twice, once in his notebook and once on a yellow legal pad he kept in his desk drawer. He re-interviewed every business owner on the main street of Harlan Creek. He traced Dorothy's morning. The co-op confirmed she'd picked up the feed receipt just after 10 a.m. The hardware store owner, Ed Merrill, believed he'd seen her truck in his lot around 10:30, though he couldn't be certain. No one at the diner recalled a green Ford F-100 that morning, but the morning rush had been busy, and the waitress working that shift had already quit and moved to Oklahoma City. There was one detail Aldrich noted and couldn't explain. In his interview with Ed Merrill's wife, Constance, she mentioned offhandedly that she'd seen a car idling behind the hardware store that morning. A dark-colored sedan, she thought, though she hadn't paid it much attention. She couldn't say if it was there when Dorothy's truck arrived or after. She couldn't describe the driver. She didn't think it mattered at the time. Aldrich wrote it down. He circled it. He asked if she could remember anything else about the car. She couldn't. Earl Ingle spent that autumn in a state that the people of Harlan Creek would politely describe as hardly there. He fed the boys, kept the farm going, got the wheat in with help from Ray Brandt and 2 other neighbors who never asked to be paid. He drove into town twice a week and sat across from Deputy Aldrich and asked if there was anything new. And Aldrich would tell him the truth, that there wasn't. Not yet. And Earl would nod and drive home. Donnie remembered his father sitting at the kitchen table after the boys were in bed, the radio on low, just sitting. By Christmas of 1971, the investigation had produced no suspects, no witnesses, and no physical evidence beyond the truck and the purse. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation had been notified but declined to take over, citing insufficient evidence of a crime. Sheriff Phelps told a reporter from the Harvey County News that the case remained open, but that they had exhausted their current leads. The article ran on page 7, below a story about a new grain elevator. Harlan Creek moved on. The Engel family couldn't. 5 years passed. Then 10. By 1981, Donnie Engel was 19 and Curtis was 17, and their father had aged in the way that grief ages a person, not at once but in stages, each year depositing something that didn't leave. Earl kept the farm. He didn't remarry. He kept Dorothy's sewing basket on the shelf in the bedroom and never moved it. By 1987, Deputy Aldrich had become Sergeant Aldrich. He'd moved to a bigger house, had 3 kids of his own, made detective. He had not stopped thinking about Dorothy Engel. He requested the case file every 18 months or so and read through it looking for anything he might have missed. He'd reached out to the KBI twice more, in 1979 and in 1984. Both times he was told the same thing: insufficient physical evidence to pursue further. The wax paper coffee cup from Dorothy's dashboard had been collected as evidence in 1971. It had been stored in an evidence envelope at the Harvey County Sheriff's Office, cataloged and largely forgotten. In 1984, when the office moved to a new building, the old evidence boxes were transferred and relogged. Nobody threw anything out. In Harvey County, they didn't do that. The box with Dorothy Engel's name on it moved with everything else, and it sat in its new home in a storage room off the evidence locker, and the years kept passing. Earl Engel died in the spring of 1998 of a heart attack, at 63 years old, on the farm he had worked his whole life. His sons buried him in the Lutheran churchyard in Harlan Creek, next to a marker that had stood there since 1972. The one the congregation had placed in memory of Dorothy when it became clear she would never be found. Donnie stood at that grave and made a quiet decision. He would not let the county file his mother away. The reward poster that Earl had taped in the window of Maddie's Diner in 1971 had been replaced twice, once when it faded beyond reading, once when the original diner closed and a new owner found it in a drawer and put it back up without being asked. By 2003, it was there still. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together lives that were lost too soon. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. It means more than you know. Now let's get back to Dorothy. The case had been cold for 32 years when Donnie Engel made a phone call that changed everything. In the spring of 2003, Donnie Engel, 41 years old, living 20 miles from the farm he'd grown up on, working for a wheat broker in Hutchinson, read a newspaper article about the use of DNA evidence in cold cases. He didn't fully understand what genealogical DNA testing was, but he understood the implication that biological material left at a scene could now be connected to a person in ways that hadn't been possible in 1971. He called the Harvey County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak to someone about his mother's case. The detective who took the call was a woman named Carla Reyes, who had joined the department in 1997 and had been assigned the Engel case as part of a cold case review she'd been quietly conducting on her own time for 2 years. She had already pulled the evidence box. She had already looked at the old coffee cup. "I want to know if what's in that evidence box is still usable," Donnie told her. Reyes said she wanted to know the same thing. The wax paper cup was sent to the Kansas Bureau of Investigation's Forensic Laboratory in Topeka in August of 2003. The Kibi's analysts were cautious about expectations. The cup was 32 years old, had been stored in a paper envelope in varying temperatures, and there was no guarantee the biological material had survived. But it had. A partial DNA profile was extracted from the rim of the cup, enough to run comparisons, not enough to guarantee an identification from a database alone. The Kibi entered the profile into CODIS, the National DNA Database, in early 2004. No match came back. The profile sat in the system. Carla Reyes did not stop. She went back to every interview in the original file. She reread Aldrich's note about the dark sedan. She tracked down Constance Merrill, now in her late 70s, and living in a retirement home in Newton. Constance didn't remember much more than she had in 1971, but she said one thing that Reyes wrote down and circled the same way Aldrich had circled his note 32 years before. It was a Dodge, I think. Dark green, and the man inside it, he was watching. Watching what? Reyes asked. The lot, Constance said. He was watching the lot. In 2019, the KB enrolled in a genealogical DNA program that allowed investigators to upload unidentified DNA profiles to consumer ancestry databases, the same websites where ordinary people search for distant cousins and trace family trees, and use the resulting relative matches to work backward toward an unknown contributor. The process required patience, a genealogist, and time. It did not require luck. The Ingle case profile was uploaded in February of 2020. By June of that year, the genealogist working the case, a contractor named Linda Horst, who had worked several KBI cold cases since 2018, had traced the DNA through 2 branches of a family tree that stretched back 3 generations. The contributor was male. He had relatives in Harvey County. And when Horst narrowed the candidate pool and cross-referenced it with the age range consistent with the DNA's contributor, a man who would have been in his mid to late 20s in 1971, one name kept appearing at the convergence point. Gerald Stump. In September of 1971, Gerald Stump was 28 years old. He had grown up in Harlan Creek. He had graduated from Harvey County High School in 1961. He had worked for a time as a driver for a grain supply company that serviced several farms in the area, including the co-op in Harlan Creek. He had known who Dorothy Ingle was. He had been in and around that co-op on the mornings when farm wives came in. He owned a 1969 Dodge Dart. Dark green, he had moved away from Harvey County in early 1972, 4 months after Dorothy's disappearance, and settled in Reno County, where he had worked a series of jobs, married twice, and become, by all outward accounts, an unremarkable man. His neighbors described him as quiet, kept to himself. Never any trouble. Carla Reyes drove to Reno County on a Thursday morning in September of 2020. Gerald Stump was 77 years old. He was sitting on his back porch when a sheriff's deputy from Reno County came around the side of the house with Detective Reyes. Stump looked up. He looked at Reyes. Something crossed his face that she would describe later as a man who had been waiting. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "I knew somebody would come eventually." He was arrested that morning on suspicion of murder in the first degree. The booking photograph showed an old man in a flannel shirt, squinting slightly at the camera. In Harlan Creek, when news reached the county, there were people who said they didn't know the name. There were others who did. One woman, 83 years old, who had been a regular at Mattie's Diner in 1971, told the Harvey County News that she remembered a young man who used to come in for coffee on the mornings the delivery routes brought him through town. She said he had a way of watching the room. She said she had always thought it was shyness. It was not shyness. Stump's Dina was formally confirmed as matching the profile from Dorothy Engel's dashboard cup. Investigators executing a search warrant at his Reno County home found, in a box in a bedroom closet, a woman's watch, a small gold Belova, the crystal cracked, the band brittle with age. Earl Engel had reported a watch missing with Dorothy in 1971. Donnie Engel, shown a photograph, confirmed it was hers. He recognized the small chip in the bezel that had happened when she'd caught it on a fence wire the summer before she disappeared. Gerald Stump was charged with first-degree murder in October of 2020. At his arraignment, he entered a plea of not guilty. His attorney argued the Dina evidence was degraded and the chain of custody on the cup was incomplete. The Harvey County District Attorney's Office rejected any offer of a plea. In May of 2022, following a 5-day trial, a jury in Harvey County deliberated for 6 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on a single count of first-degree murder. Gerald Stump was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 79 years old. He had lived freely in Kansas for 51 years. Donnie Engel was 60 years old when the verdict came in. He was sitting in the third row of the Harvey County courtroom with his brother Curtis beside him, and when the jury foreperson read the word, guilty, he said that what he felt was not what he had expected. He had expected relief. What he felt instead was grief, arriving fresh, as if the 50 years since September of 1971 had compressed themselves into a single moment and released all at once. He thought about the morning his mother drove away in the green truck. The pale, hard blue sky, her arm out the window. Dorothy Engel had wanted to be home by noon. She had a grocery list in her purse. She had feed receipts to file and a fan belt to pick up for the combine. She had 2 sons who needed supper, and a husband who needed her handwriting on the account books, and a neighborhood that counted on her tin boxes of Christmas cookies every December. She had a whole life that had been taken from her in a parking lot on a Tuesday morning by a man who had watched her from a green Dodge Dart and decided, for reasons no one would ever fully understand, that her life was his to take. She never got to see her boys grow up. She never met her grandchildren. She never grew old beside Earl in the farmhouse that still stood, under new ownership now, 12 miles outside of Harlan Creek. Carla Reyes retired from the Harvey County Sheriff's Office in 2023. At her retirement gathering, Donnie Engel showed up with a tin box tied with ribbon. Inside it were 7 different kinds of cookies. He had learned to make them from a recipe card he found in his mother's handwriting in a kitchen drawer, years after Earl died. He said she had been the kind of woman who made things for other people, and he thought it was the right thing to do. This case raises questions that don't have easy answers, and we want to know what you think. Was the original investigation in 1971 thorough enough? Or were there failures that allowed a guilty man 50 more years of freedom? What does it mean for justice when a verdict arrives after a lifetime? When the victim's husband never lived to see it? When the perpetrator is nearly 80 years old in the dock? And how many other evidence boxes, in how many other county evidence rooms across this country, contain something that technology now exists to answer, just waiting for someone to ask the right question? Justice came for Dorothy Engel after 52 years. It came because a young deputy wrote everything down twice and never threw anything away. Because a detective made phone calls on her own time. Because a son refused to let his mother be filed under forgotten. And because a wax paper coffee cup, sitting in a cardboard box in a storage room in Harvey County for half a century, held on to a truth that had no intention of disappearing. If you believe that truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, Subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More stories are waiting in the description. Thank you for being here.